Marketing bullshit. It's a large part of the reason that technical media should exist, and part of our job is to filter out things like the adjectives in the marketing materials and filter out all the obfuscation and get to the objective truth of the matter, whatever that may be. Intel's initial marketing deck contained a slide which indicated that the X series CPUs would be better for 3-way and 4-way SLI or crossfire configurations for, quote, 12K gaming, ignoring the fact that 12K gaming isn't really a thing and no one does it, or at least very few people, and other things about 12K that we'll get to momentarily. The orange bars on the slide demarcate that the K SKU CPUs, like the 7700K, are not capable of this same task of 3 or 4-way SLI or multi-GPU, or more specifically and more importantly for this video, the 7700K and other K SKUs are not capable of 12K gaming where the 7900X might be. Today we're going to be looking at that and using that as a means, or as a reason at least, to test PCIe lane scaling across 2 cards in SLI, talk about that in a moment, and see how the impact looks for gaming performance. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by our Patreon backers at patreon.com/gamersnexus. You can join there to help us with this in-depth testing and these extra feature benchmarks, which are made much easier by having the support of our Patreon backers. Or, if you'd rather, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net and pick up a shirt. We'll get to the testing in a moment, but let's start with the 12K gaming part of the slide. This is the part that needs to be pointed out immediately. First of all, to define a few things, 12K gaming as Intel defines it on that slide is probably not what most people would expect when they hear something like 12K. When you hear 8K, we know that it's scaling 16:9. 12K in Intel's example is actually a bit different, so let's break that down. Most commonly, 4K means 3840 by 2160, which equals 8.3 million pixels. Then there's 5K, which is 5120 by 2880 resolution and 14.7 million pixels, or 14.7 megapixels. We next go up to 8K resolution at 7680 by 4320, or 33.2 million pixels, 33 megapixels. So what is 12K? Well, based on this scaling, we would expect 12K to be something like 11,520 pixels by something like 6480 pixels, using a 16:9 aspect ratio. That puts us at 75 million pixels, or 75 megapixels. That's more than 2 times the pixel count of 8K, and that's a big deal. If you could play 12K games, it would be pretty remarkable. Technically speaking, 12K is not officially defined. I'm not presently aware of any displays in the consumer market which are 12K ready, but either way, it's not what it sounds like when we look at Intel's version. Intel doesn't mean 75 million pixels, Intel means 25 million pixels at a resolution of 11,520 pixels by 2160, or 3 4K displays next to each other, what we would probably call triple 4K. We emailed the company to confirm this, and that's what they said. They said it is 3 4K displays next to each other, which they are calling or abbreviating 12K. That's a 3 times difference in pixel count from what the consumer's expectation might be of 12K and what the actual meaning is behind Intel's marketing. But even then, that's not really the part that matters. Regardless of some of Intel's embarrassing marketing for this launch, like extreme megatasking, the part that matters is that they're claiming a higher resolution performs better on other CPUs. Even with PCIe lane scaling, this is still largely a marketing stunt. Here's why. This is a GPU benchmark now. Just like when AMD claimed great 4K performance on Ryzen, despite the fact that the GPU actually basically does all the work at that point and that it's completely irrelevant as a bragging point for a CPU, Intel is now piling on and claiming that triple 4K performance is because of the X series CPUs that just came out. In reality, the only reason this would ever matter is because of the lane count difference, which of course has been a major topic of discussion lately. So then, this is basically becoming a PCIe scalability test between multiple GPU configurations, in this case 2-way SLI with 1080 Ti's. And we're going with 2-way SLI because although Intel's slide and technical marketing team indicate a 3-way or 4-way SLI compatibility for multi-GPU, the fact of the matter is that NVIDIA does not support 3-way or 4-way SLI for gaming. It's physically impossible to do it. So with Pascal, that's the reality. The only way you could do 3-way or 4-way with a relevant card at this point would be to do something with either AMD or with the Maxwell series, in which case even 3 980 Ti's would not equate the power of two 1080 Ti. So you really might as well just do this. And as for AMD's cards, you've basically got RX 580s right now. Vega's not out. And so from that perspective, you'd have to pile on 3 or 4 580s to come close to doing what 2 of these could do. That's not to down talk the 580, but this really isn't what it's meant to compete with. So what you end up with is something where there's a very specific use case where this test can make sense, and then the rest of them that would actually draw all those PCIe lanes Intel's talking about just don't work anymore. It doesn't work with Pascal, and there's no point in doing it with the RX 580s. Maybe with Vega, but that doesn't exist today on the market, so we can't quite test that just yet. Intel does have a point that the lane count of some of the X series CPUs is significantly higher than the lane count of the previous K-SKU CPUs, but they also indicate on the slide that the 6 to 18 core parts are the only one that the statement applies to, which means that the Kaby Lake X parts need not apply. And that said, the 6 core and 8 core parts, as Paul has been saying quite frequently on his channel, actually have 28 lanes. Sure, that's still better than 16 on the 7700K, but that still doesn't get you to 2 by 16 cards. Anyway, we emailed Intel about the fact that 3-way and 4-way SLI and Pascal is not possible for gaming and asked if the company would like to respond for this video. Intel's official statement to Gamers Nexus is the following. The 12K gaming mentioned in the table from our product briefing info for press included an error referring to an older PC gaming GPU configuration. The X series platform enables true PCIe by 16 plus by 16 configurations. Whether or not it performs better is dependent on the software and the graphics vendor. So having gotten through the marketing screw-up and Intel's statement to us, what we're left with is actually a really cool testing opportunity for PCIe lane scaling on 2 different CPUs. We did this before with the same CPU, where we used motherboard BIOS to basically toggle by 8 versus by 16 lanes, but now we're testing it with the 7900X versus the 7700K specifically to verify Intel's marketing claims, and then hopefully as collateral to that, you'll get a benefit in figuring out if doing something like 2 1080 Ti's is actually worth it on either one of these platforms with regard to lane availability. So with the 7900X configuration, we're doing a few things. One, we're running it stock in some of the tests, and we're also doing a configuration where we've overclocked it to equate the 7700K stock CPU clock speed, 4.5 gigahertz, and we've also disabled 12 of the threads, leaving it with 8. That puts it at basically a 7700K. So for those tests, we're looking at more of a direct comparison, core-to-core, clock-to-clock of PCIe lane bandwidth differences between the 2 platforms, where one can peel off 32 lanes to the 2 GPUs, and the other one is peeling off 16 in 8 and 8, or in the former, 16 and 16. Anyway, let's get to the testing. Remember, the scope is that Intel is saying a 7700K isn't rated for triple 4K, or what they erroneously call 12K, and is saying that the X series is better for it. The implication is of better PCIe lane performance as marked by the orange bars on their slide. Last time we did a PCIe SLI scaling test, we saw less than 1% difference. This time we're being a lot more judicious with a minimum run count of 5 test passes per test, collecting standard deviation as well, and having spoken with NVIDIA and SIs about test scenarios that would most likely show a PCIe scaling difference so that we can really put this thing to the test rather than testing 30 some odd games and really finding out that it doesn't do anything. It turns out, even in the best possible light, none of it matters. And well, there's one exception, but we'll get to that. Now, one problem here, we don't have 3 4K monitors to test with, and if we did, we wouldn't have space with it. But there's an important thing here. With this type of testing, all that really matters is the pixel count. So 3 4K monitors would give you a pixel count of 24,883,200 pixels, and using our rarely used resolution that we found, we are on 6651 by 3741, so that gives us 24,881,391 pixels. You subtract that from the first and end up with an 1809 pixel difference. Really not bad. That is so insignificant that we can basically call these resolutions the same and carry on with our testing. And one more note here, we're using DSR to achieve these resolutions. In the past, we've tested DSR scaling and its impact on performance, or the performance hit to do the scaling. And in that testing, along with more recent testing for this, we see a scaling of about 1 to 3%. So there's really not a big difference in a way that would make this different in a meaningful fashion from if you actually had a monitor at this resolution, or 3 4K monitors at this pixel count. So that's what we're working with. We've got a 1 to 3% tag from DSR, but it applies equally to all of the tests, so basically doesn't exist for the purpose of this testing. And other than that, we're working with 6651 by 3741. Now for the final testing information, a couple more important things. One, multi-GPU is really hard to find modern games that actually scale well with. I mean, we've tried it in recent history, and the options are basically Sniper Elite and maybe 1 or 2 other games. Really not that many. Sniper Elite is kind of the seminal example. So that's the first thing. Just because there might be scaling in the games we're using here doesn't mean you should expect multi-GPU to actually be worth it in anything you do IRL, outside of a testing environment. The next thing, the things that in the past have tended to stress PCI interface limitations the most have been synthetic tests. That's Firestrike with custom tuned settings to really blast the GPUs. Now Time Spy, now Superposition, and then we can also look at something like Ashes of the Singularity, which is for all intents and purposes synthetic. And we've also got a couple of games in here as well that have been proven to generally show good SLI scaling or PCIe lane testing in the past. One of them, Crysis 3, it's a bit old, but it works really well for this purpose. And then the other, Sniper Elite 4, which has a nearly 2x scaling on multi-GPU. That is the best we can get for getting both of these things to pump out data to their maximum potential, basically. We've got a couple other games in there as well, but for full testing methodology, check the link in the description below. And then for tests where we've got the 7900X with cores and threads disabled and the clock boosted, that's basically to eliminate the final variable, which is this thing has more threads and a different clock. So that's why that's done. With Firestrike configured to Firestrike Ultra with a custom 6651 by 3741 resolution, which we are going to call 25 megapixel resolution from here on out because it's easier, we're seeing the i9 7900X CPU and dual 1080 Ti FTWs operate with graphics scores of 27.4 and 15.7 for 1 and 2, compared to the 7700K scores of 26.96 and 15.34. This data was collected over 5 test passes each, producing a margin of variance of plus or minus 0.1 FPS. Not percent, just 0.1 FPS resolution on these tests. That's pretty accurate. So we're looking at a performance difference in the range of 1 to 2% max. We could somewhat confidently state that the extra 8 lanes account for this, but frankly, the 8-thread 4.5 gigahertz version of the 7900X helps us find out that that's not necessarily the case. This runs frame rate closer to the 7700K and averages out to 26.53 FPS for graphics 1, 15.01 for graphics 2. Once we've controlled for threads and speeds, even that 1 to 2% window pretty much goes away. It is now within test-to-test variance. The graphics score differences come down to 4597 versus 4497 if you care, a 100-point difference, which is again accounted for by less than 1 FPS for graphics 1 and less than 0.5 FPS for graphics 2. But what if we made the test easier? Let's go down to Firestrike Ultra at 4K, just because. Now by eliminating enough load from the GPU to allow the CPUs to start showing a difference, we see scaling of a couple frames. The difference is about 3 FPS on graphics 1 with the 7900X in the lead, and about 3 to 4 FPS on graphics 2. But again, at this point, we can no longer confidently state a difference caused by PCIe lanes. Disabling threads and normalizing for speed helps with that a bit. We see the 8-thread 7900X running a 75.48 FPS graphics 1 score and 48.1 FPS graphics 2 score. That brings us to about a 2% difference in graphics 1. At this point, it looks like that could be an advantage of the extra lanes. We're not fully confident because it is pretty close, but it does look that way in this particular test. Time Spy doesn't have a 25 megapixel configuration that we could run, so we ran it at 4K. This one posts an FPS difference of about 2.3 FPS for graphics 1, the 7900X leading, and about 1.6 FPS for graphics 2. Respectively, the percent scaling yields an increase in performance of 3.9% and 2.8% for the 7900X. This difference, again, starts to hinge more on the CPUs at 4K than on the lanes. So let's increase the resolution and load on the GPUs, again, just to really stress the PCIe interface. We're using Unigen Superposition now, and it doesn't have a 25 megapixel setting either, but it does have 8K, which is a higher pixel count of 33 megapixels versus 25 of triple 4K. We're seeing an average FPS across 5 runs of 30.89 versus 30.95, technically favoring the 7700K. This difference is within our test variance, with our margin of error calculating out to plus or minus 0.25 FPS. Again, basically equal. Even the minimums output by the software are close, and we don't normally like minimums, with the maximums also nearly equal. And the score, if you're curious, comes out to 4129.5 on the 7900X versus 4138 on the 7700K within variance of test-to-test passes. They are the same. The PCIe lane advantage isn't helping, and the X series isn't magically better at this nigh unattainable 8K resolution. Let's get back to that 25 megapixel number again by using games. With Crysis 3, which is old but still one of the best graphics benchmarking tools available for PCIe lane scalability, we're seeing a difference of about 1 FPS average. Our test variance here is 0.76 FPS, which is most of 1 FPS. So that means our CPUs are again effectively equal. We cannot confidently declare that one is better than the other, which means that we cannot confidently declare if there's a difference because of the PCIe lanes. And of course, because everyone just looks at the charts to claim a victor, people are still going to say the 7700K is faster. That might be true if you were to analyze it really heavily and do a whole bunch more test passes. But as it stands now, we must abide by the confines of our numbers, and those say that the two CPUs are equal in their respective configurations. With Ashes of the Singularity at 25 megapixels and extreme settings using 8-tap MSAA and DirectX 12, we see that the game stresses the GPUs to a point of running at around 40 FPS. Honestly, that's still fairly impressive performance overall given the resolution, but then again, it's a synthetic benchmark. But with regard to scaling performance, it's not a huge difference, though we are seeing more of one than we saw in the other titles. This is a DirectX 12 bench, so that could account for some of the differences. The 7700K runs at 39.9 FPS average, 13.5 1% lows, and 11.9 FPS 0.1% lows, compared to the 4-core 8-thread 7900X variant, which starts at 42 FPS average. We're looking at a performance increase with the extra lanes of about 5 to 6%. The 7900X without its overclock does better in frame time variance, consistent with our upcoming Sniper Elite results next. Sniper 4 is another special kind of game. We had Ashes of the Singularity, which has been built very heavily for benchmarking purposes and so means that it is optimized for hardware. Sniper Elite 4 is also optimized for hardware. In our recent multi-GPU benchmarks, we showed about a 100% scaling with Crossfire 580s and Sniper Elite only. Very few modern games manage this feat. With this game, we're seeing scaling of about 100% even with DX11, which was used because NVIDIA's cards seem to put more load on the PCIe bus when using DX11. Even with all of this going for it, with all that utilization of both GPUs, we're seeing Sniper Elite 4 roughly tied between tests. The 7700K runs at about 54 FPS average with 49 and 42 FPS lows. The average was 54 FPS every single pass, so that's consistent, and the lows have a plus or minus error of about 1.7 FPS. The 7900X 8-thread CPU ran about 53 to 54 FPS average with a range plus or minus 0.3 FPS and lows at 42 and 35 with a range of 0.5 and 1.7 respectively. Some of this difference can be chalked up to our increased voltage and the overclock with regard to the low performance, the frame times, which sometimes show a frame time variance change because you're overclocking and overvolting, so things can happen. The non-overclocked 7900X was more stable though at 55 FPS, 48 FPS, and 42 FPS respectively, average 1% and 0.1%. Finally, Total War Warhammer helps us get a wider spread of game variety, but ultimately also fails to produce any meaningful differences. The 7700K runs an average FPS of around 36 here with lows at 21 and 20. The 7900X manages 37 FPS average, but it has too many other variables at play, so we can lock it down. Increasing the clock speed and disabling 12 threads makes for the better test, putting us at about 38 FPS average. The clock speed matters more than cores in this game, but it's clear that the CPU is still at play here. We cannot confidently state an advantage from PCIe lanes alone in this test. If there is one, it's in the range of 3 to 5% or thereabouts, and would vanish the moment you decrease load on the GPUs and increase load on the CPUs. So looking at all of these, there's really mostly no difference in terms of performance from PCIe lanes and scaling them, but we did see 5 to 6% scaling in Ashes of the Singularity with DirectX 12 and 3 to 5-ish, 5.5 with Total War Warhammer. There's no real scaling to speak of in Sniper, none really in Crysis, and the synthetics didn't seem to much care either. Even if you're going to play triple 4K or do some kind of very high resolution monitor, 8K maybe, at the end of the day, you're not going to torture it the way we are. We're putting these things through ultra settings, 8-tap MSAA, which just seems wholly unnecessary for this kind of resolution, and trying to put as much load on the PCIe bus as possible. It is our intention to stress the PCIe bus. What happens though if you back off of that. Well, if you scale back and you lower the load on the GPUs, you end up coming back to the CPU and loading it. So at that point, we're looking at something that would level out and completely nullify, for the most part, any actual PCIe lane differences that you might encounter. Regarding PCIe lanes for GPUs, the concern seems a little blown out of proportion. However, there is still a concern for PCIe lanes in general on these CPUs because, one, it'd be a hell of a lot easier to understand what's going on and what's supported between platforms and CPUs if they were either all the same or just had more lanes. And two, you still need to be cautious about what you're buying with regard to high-speed I/O devices, how many you're using, and whether or not you care about going through the DMI versus just talking to the CPU directly. So all of that matters as well, but it looks like with our testing, the GPU performance isn't quite as big of a deal as some of the other stuff is with this platform, and there are plenty of other problems. The biggest thing here is that Intel is damaging its brand credibility by making claims like 12K gaming, pointing at 3- and 4-way SLI as a reason, which is not really possible again, and we end up looking at the same performance as the 7700K for the most part. Now, ultimately, even with all of those caveats, none of this matters because multi-GPU scaling is so rare anyway. I don't think have ever recommended it in all the years of working with SLI and Crossfire. I don't think either one has gotten our recommendation. There are specific instances where you would do multi-GPU, maybe like production, where you're just going to run Blender and task your rendering to each card, in which case it doesn't care about SLI. Or maybe you have a very specific use case for gaming and you've already purchased the best card in terms of raw performance on the market, whether that's a Titan X or a 1080 Ti or maybe in the future some Vega variant. If you buy one of those, maybe multi-GPU makes sense because you have nowhere else to go above you. But for the most part, this is something that is a really limited use case. The scaling does not look like it matters in a lot of instances, but quoting our NVIDIA industry contacts, you'd really have to test 30 plus titles to get a full spread and truly understand what it looks like across everything on the market. But for games that do actually scale with SLI and scale well, it's hit and miss with mostly miss, especially on the synthetics, which often do stress things the most for PCIe. So that's all for this one. If you'd like to help us with this type of testing, as always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, or you can subscribe for more information. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.